The zombies in the original Dying Light were so good that they still hold up 8 years after the game launched. But the question is, how do they compare with the new Dying Light 2 zombies? Well, to answer that, I thought it was about time that I got into some of my biggest issues with the sequel and show you why the original zombies are a tough act to follow. So I want to start with how realistic the zombies of Dying Light are, and to make it fair, both the DL1 and DL2 footage in this video were recorded on PS5 in balance mode. Of course, the original game has had some graphical updates throughout the years, but they really got the base models and core mechanics right from day one in my opinion. So much thought went into making this colourful and diverse bunch of zombies into believable three-dimensional things that they really did manage to make them look solid and physically realistic. At the start of the game they're all weak and scantily clad, but as the game progresses they gain more clothes of all different types that sometimes give you an indication as to what they were doing in Haran before the outbreak. The way the light reflects on the different materials of their clothes and shines off their jewellery and skin textures is amazing. And you can even see bruises, veins and angry looking sores all over them. It's so good. Most importantly though, they still look human and even make facial expressions, and their eyes really do seem to focus on you when they notice you, making any interaction with them feel much more real. Honestly, all Techland needed to do to improve on these incredible designs is increase the details to make them look even more realistic. After all, that's what other devs normally do with their sequels, and rule number one of a sequel for me is that it must feel like you're in the same universe. So with that in mind, I cannot get my head around why we ended up with this. Why on earth Techland decided to take such a massive departure from the original art style is baffling to me, and in my opinion a terrible mistake. I guess you could argue that the new zombies are very detailed and have very realistic skin textures, but somehow they still manage to look like cartoons. It's the equivalent of taking this zombie Homer cartoon, making it 3D and adding a realistic texture over it, and despite all of that it still looks like a cartoon character. It's just so weird that even though you can technically spin 360 degrees around these models, they still somehow look kind of two-dimensional. And they're nowhere near as solid looking or even human-like compared to the original zombies. What made the original zombies more believable was how they behaved towards you and reacted to the environment around them. I love that you'd sometimes get a random ex-plumber swinging a wrench at you and they actually turn their heads like they've really seen you before they react, whereas the new zombies just seem to magnetise onto you whenever you get within a certain distance from them. The OG zombies even looked up and directly at you, grabbing at the air if you were out of reach on a car, but the new guys just shamble around below you, not even really appearing to see you. Now they do climb onto vehicles to come after you, but it just looks like they're programmed to do that and really takes you out of the realism. And again, when you compare the two, you really see how inferior the DL2 animations are to the original. The struggle was real for the OG zombies, and they even fell flat on their faces when trying to get down again, and it's stuff like that that gave them character. And it's always funny when they fall into random holes. And then there's this sorry excuse for a realistic interaction. There is nothing solid looking about this at all. It's still so broken even a year after launch. The old zombies would stagger over bumps and hilariously trip over small ledges, but the DL2 zombies can simply walk through stuff like that as if it isn't even there. A nicely timed dodge on a rooftop could send the originals falling to their doom, but of course that doesn't happen in DL2 either, and they just will not fall, even when they are clearly not standing on a solid structure anymore. They do go over with some persuasion, but the results still pretty underwhelming. Another thing is how even when the OG zombies were dead, they actually looked like they were there lying on the ground instead of magically floating above it. One of the most satisfying things about the original zombies was how a targeted hit from a sword or machete would take off any limb you liked, and it really felt like you'd actually done it. You could have a bit of fun by chopping off their arms and watching them stagger around aimlessly afterwards, or you could take off a leg to immobilise them. Another great feature was how you could actually take chunks out of them, revealing internal organs and broken ribs, and even this was mostly survivable, and they would still sometimes manage to wander around like this. The Gore system in Dying Light 2 has undergone many improvements since launch, giving greater chances of decapitations and dismemberment etc, but it still feels much less targeted and more random, and so it makes the experience less satisfying than it was in DL1. Also, the impact of a weapon would cause realistic effects on the DL1 zombies, depending on whether it was blunt or sharp, and the results felt satisfying. The slow-mo effect of a perfect hit felt earned, never took you out the moment, and the X-ray skeleton was so well done that it still managed to look three-dimensional, and the bodies basically behaved like there really was a skeleton inside them. Techland recently added the skeleton effect to DL2, but I can't seem to make it happen on PS5. It does happen on my Steam version, but the effect isn't as good as the original. Also, the original zombies would actually try and stay upright and resist your attempts to knock them over in a realistic way. It really looked like they were making an effort to get back up off the ground afterwards too. Another criticism of DL2 is the placement of the new zombies seems far less random, and as with many aspects of the game, they have that copy and paste feel of finding the exact same groups around military convoys or in Forsaken stores, etc. Whereas in the original, you can find entire fields chock full of all zombie types in the following, or among the vehicles along the motorway bridges in the slums, or market squares in the old town, and they all looked naturally placed and much more realistic. It feels less samey, and you'd often have random encounters with monsters in unexpected places that were full-on action scenes playing out without you even needing to trigger it. I know PKs can often be found fighting zombies in DL2, but again, it all looks very samey because you'd literally just seen the same exact scene happen a few blocks away. The fact that volatiles could be lurking around any corner in the first game made it so much more scary. They literally just wander around the map at night, so it's easy to be spotted by them, and then it's panic time. Techland have said that they're going to address the lack of roaming volatiles in DL2, so hopefully they can slowly bring them all back out of their fixed locations and away from high-level chases in future. So, speaking of monsters, how do the less human-looking zombie variants from both games compare? I suppose the goons were the most human-like monsters in the original game, with the main difference just being their huge size, and I think they look pretty believable, and they still displayed similar human behaviours to the smaller zombies. The faces are detailed and the skin texture looks organic and almost amphibian-like, with muscle and sinew, and again, they still look like a large physical thing even when dead. In contrast, the DL2 goon looks nothing like a human anymore, and strangely, when they die, they seem to shrink and shrivel up a bit when they're laying on the floor. They have made demolishers look more human-like in DL2, but somehow they still fail to have that physical presence of their predecessors, and they're nowhere near as much fun to encounter, even when they're dead. Bolters in DL2 are a huge downgrade on these awesome looking originals, and they've now just become these skinny human-like zombies with big feet. The rubbery toads that always got you from a distance with their poisonous phlegm have been replaced by these inferior looking spitters. I mean, if you compare this thing to the original, there is no comparison. Arguably the greatest shame is the lack of these creepy little guys in the sequel. The Howlers are no replacement for this, and it's not like there aren't kids in Villador, so they could have done it. And the only monster in the game that resembles the original is of course the Volatile, but again, they have a much less organic look than the originals. The old ones had this shiny, fleshy looking skin that reflected the light well, and they even had protruding veins along the arms. And the new ones, well, again, they've got that kind of hand-drawn, terrible artistic style about them, and they've got them weird beady little eyes that just seem lifeless. And that is the common theme of every zombie type. It all boils down to that horrible art style and laughable physics in the game that I feel are never going to be rectified now. Now, I'm not sure what a complete reskin of every character model would involve, or if it's even possible at this late stage of the game, but left as it is, it simply doesn't feel like Dying Light should, in my opinion. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Dying Light 2 is a bad game, I have had a lot of fun with it, but its many issues are hard to overlook. And before you say the first game wasn't perfect at launch, it was nowhere near as poorly realised as the sequel still is after a whole year in the wild. So you've probably guessed who I think are the winners in this contest, but I feel that this comparison really lays bare just how inferior the Dying Light 2 zombies are to their predecessors. To be honest though, I really can't see Techland going back on any of their art style choices. But this, along with many other terrible decisions in the design process, is a fundamental flaw in the game for me. Personally, I'd rather they prioritise the graphics and the physics of the game instead of wasting time adding more new content, because that new content is still going to suffer from the same fundamental problems that the game has. Now, I've been a big fan of the original Dying Light, and my channel would be nothing without it, but I cannot pretend that what they gave us in the sequel is anywhere near as well put together or as much fun. It's very sad and it pains me to have to highlight everything wrong with Dying Light 2, but honestly, how can Techland look at this comparison and be happy with how it turned out? So what do you think? Am I being too harsh on Dying Light 2, or am I just being real about the state of the game? Let me know in the comments as always, and if you enjoyed the video then please leave a like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.